welcome to the very first episode of Highway to Hill, a pro-Congress podcast about the messiest and most important branch of government. I'm Charlie Hunt. I'm a political scientist at Boise State University, and I am joined, as I always will be, by friend, colleague, fellow political scientists, SoRelle Gaynor from University of Virginia. Hey, SoRelle.
Hey, Charlie.
So we've got, as you know, a lot to talk about, including the recent ICE and Border Patrol killings in Minnesota and how Congress, of all institutions, might address them. But since it's our very first episode, we are happy to be here, but we figure we should tell you exactly why we're here. You may or may not know that SoRelle and I are co-authors on a textbook about Congress. We wrote that textbook with our good friend Casey Burgett. SoRelle, I think we were hoping with this project to kind of go beyond the textbook a little bit. What's sort of your take on why we're all here doing this?
Yeah, I mean, Congress is super confusing by design, right? The confusion helps give them some protections, which is what we'll talk about today. Our hope is that we can take kind of our textbooky PhD knowledge and apply it to current events so that we can all have sort of a more focused expectation for holding Congress accountable and, maybe calling them and having super specific demands, voting on these kinds of things at the ballot box, right? So if we can break down the really complex stuff, then hopefully it makes us all just kind of understand what's going on.
Totally. And I think one other important thing for people to know about us, which is probably not a popular opinion, but like I'd said, we're pro-Congress. Like we want Congress to be, well, maybe not pro this Congress, but we're pro-Congress generally, like as a legislative institution. One thing I think we're going to talk about a lot on this show is how Congress has sort of sublimated itself, particularly to the executive branch in the past few decades. And that, I think SoRelle and I are both people who want Congress to be the best version of itself that it can possibly be. And obviously there are disagreements about what that means. But I think that's something we want to get into a little bit as well.
Yeah, it's the first branch. It's the founders prefer. This is what they spent all their time talking about and figuring out how to work. And it's like the novel piece of American democracy, and it's not doing its job. And
it's the one closest to us, right? The representatives that we have in Congress. We may love them, we may probably hate them, but they're sort of our best hope for like having our voices heard in the legislative process. So that is sort of generally why we're here. And we couldn't, I think, have picked a more sort of definitely unfortunately newsy week to begin with. So today on Highway to Hill, the fallout continues from the tragic killing of Alex Pretti, the ICU nurse who was gunned down in Minneapolis by federal agents for the apparent crime of trying to help up a woman who the agents had shoved to the ground. A million different things we could say about this, a million different ways, I think, SoRelle, that both of us, we could spend the whole half hour just being really outraged about what happened, but I think there's plenty of that already. And so what I think we want to talk about is what Congress has to do with what happened in Minneapolis, right? This is something that happened in one specific place and happened with federal law enforcement. So let's start with that, SoRelle. Like what is Congress's role here? What is it they can maybe do about this?
Yeah, so I mean, DHS is an executive branch agency. It falls under the executive branch. They report to the president, right? But kind of like the main job of Congress, in the Constitution, in our policymaking, is oversight, right? And this happens in a few different ways. One would be, high-profile hearings and nomination hearings and investigations, writing legislation. But a big one is funding these programs and funding the government, right? So DHS cannot operate. No agency can operate unless Congress funds them, right? And so this funding process gives them not only the dollars they need to do their job, but also how they're allowed to spend this money, right? And so timely, as Charlie, as you noted, right, there was this awful murder. And then, of course, this week, the Senate is voting on funding DHS, right? So obviously a lot of the funding already came through the big beautiful bill, but there is still a portion of funding to essentially keep the agency open that Congress is voting on today.
Yeah. So, I mean, one interesting thing that happened here was that, in the week before the Pretti killing, the House had voted on this funding package that covered a bunch of different agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security. And so they had passed that actually with some Democratic support, which we can go back to. A bunch of those Democrats are now saying they regret this vote in light of what happened last weekend. And so that happened, and then this murder happened that has sort of shocked the conscience of the whole country, basically. And so now that has totally changed, I think it's safe to say, the dynamics in the Senate, because the Senate has to pass this. And even though the Republicans are in the majority in both of these chambers, in the House, Republicans could have passed that legislation. They could have passed it with a simple majority, so just 50% plus one. And they did a couple of things that I think are really interesting to kind of try to jam the Democrats on this.
Yeah, I'm going to put on my textbook author hat for a moment and just remind the listeners how the filibuster works, and that will explain the jam, right? So every time, not every time, but the norm is now that when a vote comes up in the Senate, basically to have a vote on the actual bill, the senators need to come to a collective agreement that they want to stop discussing the bill, they want to stop debate, and then actually take the vote. That vote to end debate and have the actual vote, that requires 60 votes, right? That's the 60 vote threshold. So we commonly refer to that as the filibuster, right? There are 53 Republicans in the Senate, which means in order to get past that filibuster, that threshold, you need 7 Democrats. So Republicans, knowing Republicans a House, they get the first kind of go at spending legislation. That's in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. They said, all right, we know we're not going to get 7 Democrats just to fund DHS. So we're going to couple it with other things that Democrats like. This is a very common strategy. We're going to couple it with labor, right? Education. So by packaging these things together and sending it over to the Senate, they're kind of like, all right, take all of it or nothing, because not only did they send it over, after they voted, the House voted, passed it over, they went out of town, which is like their favorite thing to do. It is another strategy, because anything that the Senate passes, in order for it to become law and go into effect before the government shuts down, it has to be the exact same piece of legislation. So the House said, here's our bill. You can vote on this and keep the government open, or you can try and mess with it, add amendments, break it apart. But we're out of town and we can't vote on it to keep us from shutting down.
Yeah. And so that was something that I think they thought would work, and maybe would have worked if we could still go back in time and have it be last week, but it's not, right? Things have changed so much in the last week. That has, I think, been out of the question that enough Democrats would support this bill as is. In fact, just before, we're recording this on Thursday, so just before we started recording, the Senate did officially reject that package as is in sort of a test vote that they would call it. And so these negotiations are going to continue. The Republicans have sort of tried to refocus the conversation on these other aspects of the bill, like funding the Coast Guard or the Secret Service, on a lot of these other things, even within the DHS package, that is not about ICE or not about Border Patrol. But unless they're willing to sort of break these things apart, it seems unlikely that we're going to, get to a full agreement before Saturday when the funding runs out. Because like you said, SoRelle, like the House is out of town. They're not exactly going to leg it back to Washington, at least until they're sure that there's some kind of a deal in place. So sort of turning to the Democrats then, SoRelle, they don't have a lot of things. They don't have a lot of tools here, right? Like we said, they're in the minority in both chambers. They don't have the presidency. But because of this filibuster, like you said, they have some leverage. They can make some demands, unlike in the House. So like what are some of the things that they are looking at as possible leverage, things that they can get out of this bill during whatever negotiating period is bound to come next and is already happening.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing is what you've already mentioned, which is, what Schumer is really working with the White House on right now. And it's interesting, he's working with the White House and not Senator Thune, his partner in the chamber, right? Because Republicans know who their leader is, right? So what Schumer's working on first and foremost is trying to separate DHS out of these away from these other 5 bills, right? Let's pass these 5 that are in agreement and have already been negotiated on, through the bipartisan work of the Appropriations Committee. And we'll deal with this politically toxic and challenging one later, which would lead what we call to a partial shutdown, which means only the agency that's not funded would shut down. So that's the first thing. The reporting is saying that Schumer would like a kind of temporary funding for just 1 to 2 weeks. Republicans want 3 months or ish. So that's one piece of negotiation. There's also the possibility for actual policy changes through the appropriations process. We call these riders. They're writing on the funding piece. So this is things like removing masks, agents not being able to wear masks, prohibition on deporting U.S. citizens and mass protesters. This was actually an amendment in the House version that was removed by the White House. So
also, sorry, something I wouldn't have thought we would need to put in a bill like this, but
yeah, kind of red flaggy, right?
Right.
That it was removed.
Yeah.
And technically
it is for granted.
Right. It is already the law, but it has not been followed, not only in this administration, but this has occurred prior. Ending arrest quotas, right? That agents have, the reporting from ICE agents have said that this is what's driving a lot of their behavior. Training requirements, far less training required for ICE agents than police officers, military personnel, right? So, and then Senator Tina Smith, who represents Minnesota, had an op-ed today, Thursday. I won't vote for the spending bill until ICE gets out of my state. So there's also these questions of federalism and allowing states, state police agencies to, perform investigations and, manage their own business, right? So there's a lot of policy asks floating around, which again is Schumer's goal, to remove this piece and say, like, all right, just give us a few more weeks to really iron these out. I think they see that they have some leverage here.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's interesting, like Schumer has said 2 weeks, but the White House wants, 3 months. Politically speaking, I think we can sort of see what's going on here, right? That Democrats, I think, understandably want to sort of harness this moment that everybody's paying attention and is really outraged by what happened. I think probably the White House and Republicans are hoping that things might cool down in the next few weeks, that that the other issues might take precedence, that they can sort of throw more, maybe we'll go back to trying to acquire Greenland or something, and it will take this sort of off the front burner. And it does matter because the president, whatever we think about him, is sort of what we would call in poli-sci a veto point, right? That even if, and I think this is part of why John Thune is not sort of directly negotiating with Schumer, that he understands and everybody understands that anything they agree to, Trump has to be on board because he has to sign this legislation. And that sort of brings us to another set of actions that I think a lot of activists seem to want and that many senators have called for, but that I think are tougher to do in the legislative sphere and through this vehicle, which is, fire Kristi Noem, the head of the DHS, fire Stephen Miller, right? Get Greg Bovino out of Minneapolis, which they have already accomplished. Things like an independent investigation of Alex Pretti's killing that a number of Republican senators have called for. And like you said, SoRelle, sort of removing ICE and CBP from Minneapolis, which sort of the White House has vaguely signaled that they are going to do in some capacity. That's still kind of ongoing. This is in conjunction with, ICE's presence in other states like Maine, which of course is home to Senator Susan Collins, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, so very powerful, and also, as we know, like one of the key swing votes on basically anything the Senate has done in the last 20 years. So she's a very important voice in this process. All of these, though, I think are really tricky because all of them kind of depend. They're sort of executive level actions in the executive branch, so they all depend on the White House keeping its word, which I think basically nobody, even most Republicans, trust them to do
Right.
at this point after everything that's happened, right? So a lot of things on sort of the wish list for changing this unsustainable situation that we have right now. A lot of things that people want, but I think even a lot of activists recognize they won't get dealt with in this bill. Things
Right. I
like
mean,
abolishing or reforming ICE.
exactly. Even something like, defunding ICE, that would require a different piece of legislation because the big beautiful bill passed last summer is where most of ICE and DHS is getting its current funding from. So, the portion that's under debate in the appropriations bill is quite small in comparison uh, to what is already funded through the big beautiful bill. So again, the opportunity here is for policy writers, these smaller changes that are essentially like stipulations for how money can be spent, right? Not major overhauls. And the other piece of, you've brought up these people that people want to be removed. Again, Democrats are in the minority, so impeaching also is just really not an option unless you do have a few senators, like Tom Tillis, coming out and saying, like, we do need to get rid of Nome. But again, you would need, me doing math in real time is not great, but you're going to need 15 or
Yep.
so Republican senators to be on board with something like that. That's just really not politically feasible.
Yeah. And the
So,
House, right? You still need the House for all of this, right?
exactly, right,
So that's
right.
tough.
So I think your point about Trump being a veto point is good on these like minor sort of policy changes. We can see where that is. But also it does seem like, I don't know if your thoughts on this, but it does seem this time around that Democrats are hopefully maybe not Charlie Brown with the football, right? It seems that they are not banking on promises from the White House to do something like remove Kristi Noem. That's not really like what Schumer is saying, it seems.
I totally agree that on two levels. Like, number one, that Democrats both have way more leverage in terms of public opinion than they did last fall with the shutdown. And I think the sort of extended kind of Democratic Party network, including even a lot of activists, have, I think, level setted better of like what it is they can really accomplish here. This bill just happens to be what is on the table this week after this happened in Minneapolis. And so it's sort of useful as an inflection point of driving home their message and potentially getting some of these policy things accomplished. But in like, I think all Democrats, right, and all people who want things to really fundamentally change understand that there is really no hope for abolishing or completely rejiggering what ICE and CBP are all about until the next Democratic administration. All right, let's go to our next segment. We're going to stay on the topic, but we want to sort of do the textbook thing and dive a little bit deeper, maybe on some Congress vocab that we see tossed around a lot in news stories, but we're hopeful that we can kind of bring down to earth for you all. So, SoRelle, one of these things is sort of we mentioned the appropriations process generally, right? This idea that, this thing that's fundamental to the Constitution, that Congress has what we sort of colloquially call the power of the purse, that they are in charge of funding the government, that, the executive branch goes and carries out these laws, but they need money appropriated from Congress in order to do so. This is something, that we've been fighting over with the Trump administration over the past year, but this is what we're talking about in this case. So, in looking at all the stuff we just talked about with the process in terms of appropriations, is this how things always go? I'm guessing not.
Yeah, so in a way, yes and no. So I'll first say how it is supposed to work, right? How the budget and appropriation process should go, and then I'll talk about how it really does work, which, spoiler alert, this process we're seeing today is pretty much par for the course in the modern Congress. So how it's supposed to work is there's multiple stages, right? The first step is the White House and Congress set a budget in the spring, and the appropriators work through this budget and using sort of like the top line spending markers, say this is what we're going to spend money on. These are the specific programs we're going to spend. At the same time, this is going on. This is all happening in the Appropriations Committee. House and Senate are working together here. At the same time, in the substantive policy committees, like your Ag Committee and your Armed Services Committee and, where all the policy making happens, they're supposed to be doing what's called reauthorizations, which is their chance to kind of review programs that have been funded in the past and say, is this working? Is this program worth funding again? What policy changes do we want to make to this program as they get their funding, right? So these processes are supposed to kind of work together so that by the time Congress votes on the appropriations bills at the end of the year, when the fiscal year ends, the programs have been reviewed by the Substantive Policy Committee, and the appropriators can, in theory, pass each bill on their own. Say, okay, now we're going to pass the bill that funds the Agriculture Committee. We're going to pass the bill that funds Labor and Human Services, things like that, right? But what happens in practice is, one, the reauthorization process does not happen for the majority of programs that the federal government funds. We call this zombie authorizations, which is committees just say, let's just keep funding it how it currently is. Let's just use last year's report. That's good enough. There are a few exceptions to this rule. The Farm Bill is a reauthorization.
Mm-hmm. The defense
NDAA
one usually comes up.
is a reauthorization, right? Those happen usually on time because they're very important to members of Congress. They bring home projects to the district. But otherwise, most programs are funded and, in a way, reauthorized through appropriations. So that's why you end up with, one, an appropriations bill that has not only funding in it, but also these riders and these policy stipulations, right? So that's one thing they're doing. And the other thing, which is exactly what we're seeing this week, is they're coupling appropriations bills together, right? So think of a very popular Republican priority, let's say Department of Defense. They're going to want to pair this with something that's maybe a Democratic priority, like education and workforce, right? And they put these packages together to try and get as many members to vote for it as possible. So that's how you end up with these, massive bills that are both policy, funding, and covering a ton of things all in one.
And there are a lot of different, I think, interlocking reasons as to sort of how we ended up here. Like, I feel like the average listener is probably being like, well, it's because Congress is lazy. And like, yes, maybe they are. But it's also like the reason, and we talked about this a little bit in the last segment, but the reason, say, the Republicans would do this, would sort of pair this together, is it makes it more difficult for Democrats to say no, right? The more stuff you sort of heap on, the higher the price tag of individual pieces of legislation, the easier it is for, say there's something in there that you really don't like funding for ICE or CBP, and you vote against it, but then someone trying to sort of take a shot at you politically can then run an ad saying, well, so-and-so voted against the education budget, or like voted against such and so, Head Start or some other program.
Funding a bridge in your district, right?
So you must hate bridges, right? And so it makes it politically easier to tag them in that way.
Yeah, and it's not just like, party versus party, but these party leaders have challenging coalitions to deal with. I mean, even the Republicans are in the majority, but you have moderate Republicans and you have super MAGA conservative Republicans, right? So they also have to appeal to their own members and constituencies. Also, the things that Congress deals with are really complex. So this is my pro-Congress self coming out. I have a lot of sympathy for what Congress is expected to do, right? To ask a member of Congress to understand both broadband network servicing and providers that need appropriations funds, as well as which military planes we're going to invest in, as well as how Head Start works. Like, that's a lot, right? They know that members have their individual interests. Of course, there's some members who are there to be on TV. We'll, I'm sure, talk about them plenty.
Yes.
But they know that, members care about issues they care about. And so by coupling these things together, the hope is that they can get more support by saying there's something in here for everyone, right? Which is why when these appropriations bills come forward, they usually pass not just with partisan support, but overwhelming bipartisan support. Like I'm talking 80%, 90% of the chamber votes for it, right? So in this way, it is good. So Charlie, do you want to talk about why are we voting on this in January, right? Aren't these things supposed to be wrapped up by the end of the fiscal year?
Yeah, I mean, one other getting in their homework on time has not been a strong suit of Congress's over the past couple decades. Uh, it's been a long time since they've sort of cleanly passed a budget the way that they were supposed to do in sort of the textbook method that you laid out earlier. Congress has been operating a lot through what are usually called continuing resolutions. So similar to the zombie authorization process you talked about, right? Where we're just funding the government or funding some part of the government at normal levels for some particular amount of time, rather than sort of going back and looking at things. We had this sort of shutdown fight last fall, and they sort of set this next kind of deadline of, rather than funding it for an entire year, the agreement they came to was funding it temporarily, right? Which is, again, sort of what we're talking about now, specific to DHS. But it's like there are good reasons to do things this way, and some of the ways that you just talked about, right? It's, maybe you can get more consensus on a broader piece of legislation, which is nice, but it also makes shutdowns more dangerous, right? That if you're passing things all at once and you're funding the entire government with one bill or funding a lot of the government with one bill, it makes the stakes for failure of that piece of legislation really high because it's going to shut down more of the federal government. This is part of why I think both Democrats and Republicans in this case are saying, let's break off these 5 or 6 other pieces and just focus on DHS so that we're lessening some of the pain. And so that's, I think, one lesson that we're kind of taking from this.
Yeah, it's very all or nothing, which
Mm-hmm.
is the, negative side of this. But yeah, think of it as like a Band-Aid. We're just going to extend what we agreed to last time. But it's at a certain point, right, you do have to make these policy decisions. You do have to give agencies some stability that says this is your budget for the next 12 months. So, you know what? I guess late is better than not turned in at all.
All right, we're going to go to our last segment that we are very cheesily calling the gavel drop. So basically, show's almost over, but before SoRelle and I adjourn, we wanted to share each one more quick story about Congress, maybe a gripe we've got about Congress, and as you'll find out listening, we've got plenty, or maybe something else unrelated coming up that we want everybody to sort of keep an eye on. So I'll go first today. So I can't I'm probably not going to be able to let any episode of this show go by without talking about congressional elections. So I'm going to start talking about a development this week in a pretty red state in Louisiana, where President Trump endorsed a Republican primary challenger to Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who is up for re-election this year. Cassidy, I wouldn't say he's been a critic of President Trump, but he was one of the only Republican members of Congress in total, who voted in favor of impeaching and removing Trump following the events of January 6th a few years ago. And since then, I think Trump has sort of harbored some ill will, shall we say, towards Senator Cassidy, and Cassidy has offered some sort of vague forms of pushback in the past. But Trump endorsed a challenger, Representative Julia Letlow, a current member of the House from Louisiana. And the news is not great here for Cassidy, that almost every Republican member of Congress who voted in favor of impeaching Trump in one form or another has gone down either in a primary or just retired before they could get beat by some other Republican. I think Cassidy's chances aren't so great here. And if he does lose, there would only be 3 members of Congress from the House or the Senate, 3 Republicans left who've backed impeaching Trump back in 2021. And 2 of those others, David Valadao of California in the House and Susan Collins, our friend who we just talked about in Maine, both of those folks are also in really big trouble re-election-wise this year. So it could be that, SoRelle, that by this time next year, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska will be the last woman standing, the last Republican in Congress, just 5 years after the impeachment who has survived, who voted to impeach him. So pretty incredible stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, it says it speaks to your point earlier about him being a veto point in many different ways.
Yeah, veto point in legislation and in elections.
That is a crazy stat.
Yeah. SoRelle, how about you? What's on your mind this week?
I'm going to talk about the Ilhan Omar as well as Representative Max Frost. They were both attacked by crazy people this week. So Ilhan Omar was giving a press conference, and some guy came up and sprayed what turned out to be, I think, vinegar. And Max Frost was punched in the face at an event at the Sundance Festival. So obviously these are terrifying and gross, but they are the new norm. The day that this attack happened, the U.S. Capitol Police, which is the police force that protects the Capitol complex and members of Congress, released their threat assessment case study, which talks about how many cases that they've had to open or security breaches, security concern cases they've opened. And 2024 was the second highest, only to 2021. But around 9,500 cases open in 2024. So every year, pretty much the number of, violent statements, actions against members of Congress have increased. Members like Representative Omar, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Presley, noticeably all minority women, have spoken about this and their need to actually fund their own personal security, which is extremely expensive, right, to protect their house and things like this. But, in an effort to end on a good note, as you'll find I can be annoyingly optimistic about Congress and our government.
We do our best here.
We do our best. We're trying here. Under Democratic leadership in the House Admin Committee a few years ago, they authorized funding for Capitol Police to be used by members of Congress either in their home district in D.C. or to work with local police force to protect them. So while it's obviously tragic that these cases have increased, which I think can be directly attributed to what a lot of research has shown, political vitriol among people, but also by our leaders. While these cases have increased, it is nice to see Congress problem solve, not only getting their police force on the ground, but working with state and local officials. So if you watch the video from the Omar attack, you will see that she has her personal security. There were also state and local police force there, and they apprehended him very quickly. So Congress can solve problems, and sometimes these little ones that go under the radar are where they find the most success. So again, another incident of the week that captures a larger microcosm of what's going on in Congress, I think.
For sure. And, like I mentioned January 6th, it's like, talk about violence against members of Congress, and
Right.
You would think that this would sort of become a priority. So it's like this was an instance of Congress recognizing a big glaring problem and then making an effort to solve it. It's sad that we have to deal with it, but it is sort of kind of a reality of our sort of nationalized, polarized politics that we will, I'm sure, keep talking about. Thanks for joining us for our first episode of Highway to Hill. SoRelle, thanks for hanging out with me. And
thank you, Charlie.
Yeah, we'll see y'all next week.